September 22nd, 1944. Ede, Netherlands, 9:47 in the evening. The floorboards creak beneath her swollen feet as Anneke van der Meer lowers herself onto the edge of her bed, one hand pressed against her belly where a child kicks and turns, oblivious to the chaos consuming the world outside. Her husband has been gone for 3 weeks, taken in a razzia, rounded up with 200 other men from the village and sent east to dig trenches for the Wehrmacht. She does not know if he is alive. Through the cracked window, she can hear the distant rumble of artillery fire from the direction of Arnhem, a city that has become a graveyard. The smell of smoke drifts through the autumn air, mixing with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. Her hands shake as she lights a single candle. The electricity has been cut for days. In the kitchen below, there is half a loaf of bread left, some beets from the garden and nothing else. She is 7 months pregnant, alone and terrified. And then she hears it. A soft tapping at the back door, 3 deliberate knocks, a pause, then 2 more. She freezes. The SS patrols have been relentless since the British paratroopers failed to take the bridge at Arnhem. Every house is suspect. Every sound could mean death. But the knock comes again, quieter this time, almost apologetic. Anneke rises slowly, her heart hammering, and descends the narrow wooden stairs. Through the small window in the door, she sees a figure crouched in the shadows. A man, thin and trembling, his face pale as bone in the moonlight. His uniform is torn and caked in mud, the maroon beret of the British 1st Airborne Division clutched in his hand. His eyes meet hers, and in that instant she sees everything. Desperation, exhaustion, the unspoken plea of someone who has nowhere else to go. Her breath catches. If she opens that door, she risks everything. Her life, her unborn child's life, the fragile hope of seeing her husband again. If she does not, a man will die in the cold. Her hand trembles on the latch, and then slowly she pulls it open. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Anneke van der Meer was born in 1918 in the small farming village of Ede, nestled between the dense forests of the Veluwe and the farmlands that stretched toward the Rhine. Her father had been a carpenter, her mother a seamstress, and she had grown up in a house that smelled of sawdust and linen. She married Peter, a quiet man who worked the land his family had tended for generations, and together they had built a simple life. Sunday prayers at the Reformed Church, market days in Arnhem, evenings by the hearth with neighbors who had known them since childhood. She dreamed only of ordinary things. Healthy children, a full pantry, the sound of her husband's boots on the doorstep at the end of the day. She had no interest in politics, no understanding of the greater forces tearing Europe apart. When the Germans arrived in 1940, she watched the tanks roll through the village square with numb disbelief, clutching Peter's hand as the occupation began. For 4 years, she learned to live with less food, less freedom, less hope. And then, in September 1944, the sky above Ede filled with parachutes, thousands of them, like white flowers falling into a field of fire. She had stood in her garden that Sunday morning, September 17th, and watched the British paratroopers descend. She had felt, for the first time in years, a flicker of something that might have been hope. Liberation seemed so close she could taste it, but within days, the hope curdled into horror. The Germans counterattacked with a ferocity no one had anticipated, sending tanks and SS units to crush the lightly armed airborne soldiers. The battle raged in Arnhem, just 8 miles away, and soon the roads were choked with the wounded, the fleeing, and the dead. Peter was taken in a sweep 2 days into the fighting. The Germans needed laborers, and they dragged every man they could find from their homes. Anneke was left alone, her belly growing heavier each day, her pantry emptying, the world collapsing around her like a house with no foundation. By the time the knock came on her door, she had learned what it meant to be powerless. She had learned what hunger felt like, what silence sounded like when it was heavy with fear, what it meant to wake every morning not knowing if you would see sunset. But she had not yet learned what it would mean to choose between survival and compassion, between safety and humanity. And now, standing at her door with a British soldier swaying before her, she faced a decision that no history book would ever record, no memorial would ever honor. His name was Thomas Aldridge. He was 23 years old, born in Leeds, the son of a coal miner and a nurse. He had parachuted into Arnhem on Black Sunday, September 17th, as part of Operation Market Garden, the audacious Allied attempt to capture bridges across the Dutch rivers and open a direct corridor into Germany. It was supposed to last 2 days. But the Germans responded with 2 SS armored divisions that happened to be refitting near Arnhem. What should have been a quick operation turned into a massacre. The British 1st Airborne Division was surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from supply. Thomas fought in Oosterbeek on the outskirts of Arnhem, where the paratroopers mounted a desperate defense that German soldiers would call Der Hexenkessel, the witch's cauldron. For 9 days, they held as mortars rained down, panzer tanks closed in, and the world shrank to shell holes, burning houses, and the screams of the dying. On the night of September 25th, orders came to evacuate. The survivors were told to cross the Rhine under cover of darkness. Thomas reached the riverbank with only 6 men left from his original company of 120. They crawled through marshy fields, past German patrols, their bodies aching from exhaustion and hunger. But when they reached the extraction point, the boats had already left. They were stranded behind enemy lines, deep in Nazi-occupied territory. The other 5 men split off, each running south toward Allied lines. Thomas went east, toward the village of Ede, hoping to find shelter in the forests, but he was too weak, too slow. Within 3 days, he was on the verge of collapse. No food, no water, his boots falling apart, every breath a knife in his lungs. He knew the odds of survival were almost zero. The Germans were shooting captured paratroopers on sight. He had seen the bodies. When he knocked on Anneke van der Meer's door, it was because he saw a light, a single candle burning in an upstairs window. There was nothing else, just a light and a silent prayer. Anneke looked at the man on her doorstep and saw death following him like a shadow. He was so thin his bones pressed through his skin. His hands shook uncontrollably. Dried blood stained the side of his uniform. He did not speak, did not dare. She spoke no English and he spoke no Dutch, but no words were needed. She stepped aside and he entered, stumbling, nearly falling. She caught him by the elbow, steadying him, and guided him through the kitchen to the back of the house, where a small pantry sat hidden beneath the stairs. With hands that still trembled, she lifted a section of the wooden floorboards, planks her husband had loosened years ago to create a small storage space during winter. It was narrow, little more than a crawl space, cold and dark and infested with spiders, but it was hidden. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with mute gratitude, and lowered himself into the hole. Anneke dropped the boards back over him and dragged a threadbare rug across the opening. Then she sat in the darkness of her kitchen and began to shake, not from cold, but from the weight of what she had just done. If the SS searched the house, if a neighbor suspected, if anyone heard a single sound, she would be dragged into the street and shot. Pregnant women were not spared. Unborn children were not spared. She had just gambled her child's life against that of a stranger. And yet, when morning came and she crept down the stairs to check on him, she brought a bowl of thin oatmeal porridge, half the food she had left. She did not know why she did it. It was not heroism. It was not ideology. It was something simpler, something older. It was the inability to turn her back on a human being dying at her door. Thomas Aldridge remained beneath the floorboards of Anneke van der Meer's house for 14 days. 14 days of absolute darkness, of cold that seeped into bones, of silence broken only by the sound of German boots marching down the street outside. He could not move, could not cough, dared not breathe loudly. Twice a day, Anneke lifted the boards and passed him a small portion of food. Stale bread, raw beets, once a piece of boiled potato. She had nothing more to give. She was starving herself. Her baby kicked weaker and weaker inside her. On the 5th night, the SS came. 3 soldiers, young and brutal, marched door to door searching for hidden Allied soldiers and resistance members. They pounded on Anneke's door hard enough to crack the wood. She opened it with hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the handle. They shoved her aside and entered, their heavy boots shaking the floor, their rifles swinging from room to room. Anneke stood in the hallway, one hand pressed over her belly, praying, not to God but to the universe, to chance, to whatever force might keep Thomas quiet. If he coughed, if he shifted, if he breathed too loud, it would all be over. The soldiers searched the upstairs rooms. They tore through drawers, they kicked walls. One of them came downstairs, his steps heavy and deliberate, and stopped directly on top of the rug covering the floorboards. Anneke did not breathe. The entire world stopped. The soldier stood there for 5 seconds, 10, 15, an eternity compressed into an instant, and then he turned and walked out. They left, slamming the door behind them, their laughter echoing down the street. Anneke collapsed onto the floor. She did not cry. There were no tears left. There was only the silent tremor of a body that had held its breath for too long. The historical context of what Annika was living through cannot be understated. Operation Market Garden, launched on September 17, 1944, was one of the most ambitious Allied operations of World War II. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery conceived the plan to drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines to capture key bridges across the Netherlands, creating a pathway for armoured divisions to push into the industrial heart of Germany and potentially end the war by Christmas. But the plan depended on speed, surprise and luck, and all 3 failed. The British 1st Airborne Division, tasked with capturing the bridge at Arnhem, landed directly into the path of 2 SS Panzer divisions that intelligence had failed to detect. Instead of holding for 2 days, the paratroopers were besieged for 9, fighting house to house in Oosterbeek with dwindling ammunition, no reinforcements and no way out. Of the 10,000 men who dropped into Arnhem, only about 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed, wounded or captured. For the Dutch civilians caught in the crossfire, the battle was catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated. Families were forced to evacuate with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Food supplies were cut off. The Germans, furious at the Dutch for aiding the Allies, began brutal reprisals, rounding up men for forced labor, executing suspected resistance members, and imposing brutal restrictions that would lead to the Hunger Winter, the famine winter of 1944-45, that killed over 20,000 Dutch civilians. In this environment, hiding an Allied soldier was not just dangerous, it was nearly suicidal. And yet, across the Netherlands, ordinary people made that choice. Farmers, teachers, mothers, grandmothers, people with no training, no weapons, no protection, opened their doors and risked everything. Anneke van der Meer was one of them, but unlike many others whose stories were eventually told, hers nearly disappeared entirely. On October 6, 1944, Thomas Aldridge left Annike's house. A member of the Dutch resistance had made contact, passing word through a network of underground operatives that a route south had opened. Thomas was to leave at midnight, traveling on foot through the forests toward the village of Renkum, where he would meet other evaders and attempt to cross into Allied-held territory. Anneke gave him the last of her bread, wrapped in a cloth and a wool scarf that had belonged to her husband. They stood at the back door in the darkness, and for a moment neither moved. Thomas reached into his uniform and pulled out a small silver compass, battered and scratched, the only possession he had left. He pressed it into her hand. She shook her head, but he closed her fingers around it and whispered the only Dutch word he had learned in 2 weeks, "Dank je," thank you. Then he disappeared into the night. Anneke never saw him again. Thomas Aldridge made it across the lines. He rejoined British forces in late October and was eventually sent back to England to recover. He was debriefed by military intelligence, who recorded the broad strokes of his escape, but not the details. Not the name of the pregnant woman who had hidden him, not the village, not the house. It was standard procedure. The war was still raging, and revealing the identities of civilians who had helped Allied soldiers could put them in immediate danger. Thomas was reassigned to a different unit and sent back into action in early 1945. He survived the war, returned to Leeds, married, had 3 children, and worked as a civil engineer for 40 years. He never spoke about Arnhem, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. Like so many veterans, he buried the memories deep and tried to forget. Anneke van der Meer gave birth to a daughter in November 1944, just weeks after Thomas left. She named her Sophie. Peter never came home. She learned months later that he had died in a labor camp near the German border, killed by typhus and starvation. After the war, Anneke remarried, had 2 more children, and lived quietly in Ede until her death in 1982. She never told anyone about the British paratrooper she had hidden beneath her floor. There was no reason to. The war had ended. Survival was enough. Heroism was for other people. The story should have ended there, lost in the silence of 2 people who had shared a moment of extraordinary humanity and then moved on with their lives. But decades later, a single object brought it back. In 2003, a man named Richard Aldridge was sorting through his late father's belongings in a small attic in Leeds. Thomas Aldridge had died the year before at the age of 82, and Richard, the youngest of his 3 children, had been tasked with going through the boxes of old papers, photographs and mementos. Most of it was mundane. Tax forms, letters from distant relatives, faded snapshots from family holidays, but at the bottom of a wooden crate, wrapped in cloth, Richard found something that made him stop. It was a small notebook, barely larger than a deck of cards with a cracked leather cover. Inside, in his father's careful handwriting, were pages of notes, dates, locations, names, and on one page, underlined twice, were 3 words, Ede Anneke Floorboards. Richard had never heard his father mention Arnhem. He had no idea his father had been a paratrooper, had been trapped behind enemy lines, had been hidden by a Dutch civilian. The discovery was staggering. He began to research, reaching out to veterans organizations, contacting Dutch historians, searching archives. It took 2 years, but eventually he found a lead, a woman named Sophie de Vries living in Ede, whose mother had been named Anneke van der Meer. Richard traveled to the Netherlands and met Sophie, now in her 60s. When he told her the story, she stared at him in disbelief. Her mother had never said a word. Together they pieced together what had happened. Richard shared his father's notebook. Sophie searched her mother's old belongings and found, tucked in a drawer, a small silver compass with initials engraved on the back. T.A. Thomas Aldridge, the compass her mother had kept for 60 years and never explained. The story of Anneke van der Meer and Thomas Aldridge is not unique. Across Europe, thousands of civilians made similar choices during World War II, choices that history rarely recorded, that governments rarely acknowledged, that families rarely spoke about. They were farmers who hid Jewish families in barns, mothers who smuggled food to prisoners, grandmothers who forged documents, children who carried messages through occupied streets. They had no weapons, no rank, no protection. Most of them were never decorated, never interviewed, never remembered. They simply did what they believed was right in a moment when the world had gone insane. What makes Anneke's story remarkable is not that she was extraordinary. It is that she was so profoundly ordinary. She was not a member of the resistance. She was not politically active. She was a pregnant woman, alone and starving, who opened her door to a stranger and risked everything for no reason other than the recognition of shared humanity. She did not see a British soldier or an enemy of the Germans. She saw a terrified young man who needed help. And in that moment, the war ceased to be about nations and ideologies and became about something simpler, one human being reaching out to save another. That is the lesson history so often forgets. Wars are fought by armies, but they are survived by individuals. The great turning points we read about in textbooks, the battles, the treaties, the speeches, were lived on a smaller scale by people who never made it into the history books. People like Anneke, who hid a man beneath her floorboards not because she was brave, but because she could not bring herself to do anything else. Today, the house in Ede, where Anneke van der Meer once lived, still stands. It is a private residence, unmarked and unremarkable, indistinguishable from the dozens of other small homes that line the street. There is no plaque, no memorial, no indication that something extraordinary once happened within those walls. But if you were to lift the floorboards in the small pantry beneath the stairs, you would see the space where Thomas Aldridge spent 14 days in darkness, listening to the boots of SS soldiers above his head, holding his breath, clinging to the fragile hope that a pregnant woman he had never met would not betray him. Richard Aldridge and Sophie de Vries have worked to ensure the story is not lost again. They have shared it with historians, with schools, with museums dedicated to preserving the memory of World War II. In 2007, the Dutch government posthumously awarded Anneke van der Meer the Resistance Memorial Cross, one of the highest honors the Netherlands can bestow. Sophie accepted it on her mother's behalf, standing in a ceremony surrounded by aging veterans and their families, holding the silver compass her mother had kept hidden for 6 decades. When asked why she thought her mother had never spoken about what she did, Sophie paused for a long time before answering. Finally, she said, because she did not think it was special. She thought it was simply what any decent person would do. That quiet humility is what makes stories like Anneke's so powerful. In a world that celebrates grand gestures and sweeping heroism, it is easy to forget that the most profound acts of courage are often the smallest. They are the decisions made in kitchens and hallways, in moments of fear and uncertainty, by people who do not see themselves as heroes. They are the choices to open a door, to share a piece of bread, to hide a stranger beneath the floor, and pray that no one discovers them. These are not the actions that win wars, but they are the actions that preserve humanity in the midst of inhumanity. Thomas Aldridge survived the war and lived a long life. He built a career, raised a family, and grew old in peace, but he never forgot the woman who saved him. In his notebook, beneath the words Ede Anneke Floorboards, he had written one more line: I owe her everything. Anneke van der Meer did not survive to see her story told. She died believing that what she had done was insignificant, a small act in a vast and terrible war. But she was wrong. What she did mattered. It mattered to Thomas Aldridge, who lived because of her. It mattered to his children and grandchildren, who exist because she opened her door. It matters to us decades later, because it reminds us that even in the darkest moments of history, even when the world seems consumed by cruelty and violence, there are still people who choose compassion over fear, humanity over survival. The floorboards in that house in Ede are old now, warped and creaking, worn smooth by 70 years of footsteps. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of what happened there. You can hear the soft knock at the door, the creak of the planks being lifted, the whispered words of gratitude in a language neither person fully understood. You can hear the silence that followed, heavy and fragile, as a pregnant woman and a British paratrooper waited in darkness for the war to pass them by. And you can hear the lesson that story still carries, that the smallest acts of courage can ripple across generations, that forgotten people shape the world we live in today, and that humanity, in the end, is not defined by the wars we fight, but by the choices we make when everything is on the line and no one is watching.